Hello, everybody. This is James Diboe, Discovering, dedicated to original peoples, and we got a special guest on, Professor Kamari Clarke. How are you doing, my sister? Great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm fine, thanks. Good to be here.
Great. There's a lot of work you're involved with, there's many different things. For today, we're going to discuss basically about the Black Atlantic world. And if you can give us a bit of information on some of this project that you're dealing with of interest.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So the work underway is called Absence and Presence in the Black Atlantic World, and it really is about the ways that the Black archive is not like every archive. In many ways, our history, the last 400 years of our history, has gone underground in some ways. There are aspects of Black Atlantic cultural practices that aren't necessarily visible and seen as viable in our education system. And so much of the work at this stage has to do with putting in place an archive, an online digital archive that can be used as a tool for teaching, for learning, for pondering the challenge of methodology in the Black Atlantic world. And so, for example, one of the popular go-tos to understand Black Atlantic history is transatlantic slavery. And where do people go? They go to documents, they look at ship records, they look at insurance claims, they look at trials, they look at bills of sale. Sometimes they look at manumissions documents to figure out forms of freedom and the ways that people paid for their freedom or were freed through manumissions. And those things are often the things that are visible, that are available to us. There are other aspects of that archive that have to do with the past that are not legible to us, to historians and to others who want to understand that archive. And instead, what we end up with when we teach Black history is it becomes a narrative of the first. Who was the first Black person who became a doctor? Who was the first lawyer? Who was the
Yeah.
first senator, etc. And that aspect of the history, it becomes a celebration, but not necessarily a way to recoup that archive. And so much of the work in this digital archive has to do with thinking about things like naming practices, like proverbs and stories and adages as forms of theory building mechanisms. And it involves forms of imagination to think through when, under what context were these stories told? How can we retell them in a way that brings us to the contemporary period, that allows us to understand the context, but also, and most importantly, to understand these modes of meaning making as theory building, as ways that people built ideologies and shaped and taught the cultural practices and values of their time.
Yes, interesting. So if we deal with the past, for example, where did it begin your field of study? I understand that you have connection with Professor Small, who's introduced us. Great. And where did you begin with your study? I know you're born in Toronto, is that correct?
No, I was born in Montego Bay, but
Oh,
in
okay.
Jamaica. Yeah, I was born in the Caribbean, but we left when I was very young. I was a few months old at the time, and grew up in Toronto. So Toronto, in many ways, is home. And I spent the first 17 years in Toronto, then lived in Montreal, and then I actually spent the next 25 years stateside in the US. So I did my graduate work there, my PhD there. I did a law degree in the States, and then I went on. Um, and then by 1999, I started to teach. So I was a professor in a number of universities in the US. And now I'm back in Toronto. So you're interviewing me from Toronto, and I'm a professor here at the University of Toronto.
Great, great. Yeah, interesting to come from Montego Bay, and then going to Toronto and also in America as well. So now with when you first got into the studies of Black history, where did you begin with Black history?
Well, yeah. So it wasn't necessarily that I was a Black historian or interested in Black history. In fact, I'm a legal anthropologist, and so initially I was interested in contemporary questions about power, culture, power, law, and also religion. So I started my, I guess, academic career looking at transnational religious formation. So thinking about the ways that religious meaning travels and asking questions about the basis for the canon. So what is the canon that's used as the basis under which people determine what is morally right, what their practices are, what they should follow, why they should follow it, and then what kinds of cultural practices follow those articulations of the right, the moral right. And so in my case, I was interested in some Black Atlantic practices like Obia and Orisha voodoo and
Wow,
practices that were pushed underground because they were deemed criminal during transatlantic slavery, but that actually endured alongside Catholicism in some cases. We saw the hiding of Africanist meanings behind Catholic saints, and some of what we saw was that a given saint, Saint Lazarus, was akin to another Orisha deity, uh, Babaluaye in the Yoruba Orisha pantheon. And
interesting.
so, yeah, and so that goes back to this question about history. In fact, if you think about the things that emerged, those things were the Catholic saints and a kind of saint-based Santeria practice. But in fact, those saints also were became the mechanism through which to hide the Orisha African practice. Because it was outlawed, it was criminalized. Black people, those enslaved, weren't allowed to practice those practices. So they, uh, of course, adopted Christianity and Catholicism as practices of their own and found ways to integrate them, seeing them as interconnected and somewhat universal. So that interested me. But the challenge is always when you see these kinds of adaptations and innovations, what gets to stay and what goes, what is not as relevant and what is relevant. Why do some things take on hegemonic meaning and become predominant in a canon, and why are other things rendered insignificant? And so that in the early part of my career was one of the questions that interested me, or a couple of the questions. And from there, I went on to think about this not in religious terms, religious meaning, but in legal meaning, legal terms. So thinking about similar formations through the law. And so how do we make sense of what laws are normalized, what practices become normalized through the law?
Yes, very
Yeah.
interesting when you mentioned about Santeria as well. I visited Cuba and I came across this. Now, like you said, they've kind of had to disguise the African traditions from the Yoruba within you see them in within the saints or in the Catholicism. So it was disguised because it was outlawed. They wasn't allowed. There was a lot of things that they weren't able to continue practicing. Now, do you find this? I know it's in Cuba. We see it. I don't understand it's in Brazil, Haiti, most definitely, and parts of Trinidad. Have you found this anywhere else? Because the United States, I don't really see too much of this. Do you find it anywhere in the United States, or would you say more so the Caribbean?
Yeah. Oh, you absolutely find it throughout the United States
Right.
and
Okay.
the Caribbean. Yeah, through a range of practices. I mean, my book was about a revival, a re-Africanization movement that incorporated Orisha practices, so from West Africa to the Americas, and so it's quite widespread from Santeria to Orisha practices, Candomblé, and that has traveled to the U.S. So it's all over. People use divination and
Yeah.
uh, these modes of determining the future through these tools. And there are also a lot of controversies around these religious practices. How when people do a sacrifice where they put the carcass from an animal perhaps that has been sacrificed, what are the health code concerns about that? There are a lot of concerns about there have been some freedom of religion cases around practices and marking, the marking of children as a result of initiations. So it is widespread, and there's a lot of documentation of the legal cases and the consequences of the practices, not because they're bad, but because there are challenges to the ways that laws manage um, what kinds of practices are permissible. So when you do, for example, in Orisha practices, sometimes you have to do a sacrifice, and sometimes the sacrifices might just be not eating something, and other times it might be the giving to an Orisha or to a deity a given thing, like a dove or an animal, or um, and 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 sometimes when you do the divination, it tells people that the carcass from that sacrifice should be placed in a particular place, like at a crossroads. So that means at an intersection, which has a lot of implications, of course, to
Yeah,
because not only are you, the law will see that as littering, but it could be a health safety concern. So there are a lot of issues that maybe in times of old were totally appropriate and were guided by the oracle. And in the contemporary period, there are laws and safety codes that delimit that. And we see a lot of controversies, especially in Florida and other places around some of these challenges. And the issue then becomes how do we as a society determine what then is acceptable, and how do we allow adaptation so that people can still practice their religions with freedom, and what are the limits to that freedom? And so these are continue to be raging questions, I think, for our time.
yeah, because they really demonized African spirituality, African traditions. It's
Yeah.
from you can see it from whether it's Hollywood, whether it's
Mhm.
stuff that we grew up on. Everything is just demonized and bad. Now, even though we have different religions there, and some people could look at some of the practices of some of the westernized religions and see some faults with that, but at the same time, let freedom be. That's a problem. It doesn't matter what country you come from. If this is your traditions, your practices, people need to learn about it rather than actually demonize it. It's a big world we live in. But it's very interesting that you've dealt with a lot of these traditions, though, because we only hear the bad about these things, unless you actually go and require the research yourself, which you've done, to understand. And then there's some things, yeah, can be questionable, you know. And when I went to Kenya, I met the Maasai tribes, and the children had like little bands on the faces, do like some sort of hot um, metal iron, like that must have been put on the cheek. I asked, what is the reason for this? Now, yes, it's down to things like a ritual purpose, but they also said that they have to mark them because if they go missing, they will be returned back to the tribe that they belong because it is if you it's not like I mean we've got to put ourselves in that boat. So it made me realize that like there's so many different tribes, especially going back in history and a lot of people. So if your child ended up going missing, they could be returned by their tribal mark on their face. So I thought that was I understood the reason, even though at first I was looking, that looks quite cruel, but it's understanding, you know.
Yeah, it's so true. And in fact, in the Black Atlantic world, it's the same sort of thing. You have the ritual scarification
Yeah,
as a way to denote who is who and what their descent line is.
yeah,
So tribal and ethnic. And during transatlantic slavery, in fact, in the early days, historians have documented that that scarification was a form of safety. So if you were of a tribe that was seen as a royal tribe, you wouldn't be taken into slavery if your child had that scarification. And of course, over time, it became far more non-discriminant, and more people were enslaved. But those forms of marking had significance, and they also spoke to the sacred rituals that people underwent, deep-seated secret rituals that concretized people's places in a pantheon, in in a prestigious domain of governance. I mean, today young people look at scarification and they turn up their faces, or in some cases laws are erected to protect children from going through those processes. But understood in a historical dimension, I mean, these aren't painful things. They're sort of little, and the important thing is to make sure that they're safe. But they have significant meaning, and we need to learn more about those meanings. And I think a lot of those meanings are fading, and they're not. People don't quite understand the significance of them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a lot of contradiction to it as well from the West, where, someone can get the whole face and body tattooed, that can
Yeah,
leave a scar. So, some people could look, well, you could demonize that, but it's picking and choosing
yeah.
which is really bad and which is really good, but there's not too much of a difference, so
Yeah,
that's the thing, it's
absolutely.
picking and choosing.
It's so true. And if you think about, I mean, we get earrings, and people
Yeah,
put all sorts of things on their bodies. There's tattoos, which of course can be seen as very painful, but they're fashionable, or they're
yeah,
ear piercings, or other things that are used to enhance people's bodies. And we often see that as perfectly normal and within the realm of civility, when in fact, if we think about it, we embed meaning in those things. Tattoos we see as popular, but they're equally painful. And
yeah.
so part of it is how we see things and what the power is that shapes it as normal.
Yeah, that's it. And even like for example, I mean, you could compare the number of things, so like, it's like shops sell cigarettes, alcohol, you know, just because they say, well, this is legal, or what they will say something's legal or illegal. So either way, you're harming your body. So that's but if it's all down to making money and everything that's trending. We could talk about stuff like what we see on the TV, which it influences younger children, seeing a lot, exposed to a lot of the negativity. It doesn't matter if it's music, through acting, or anything. So it's always picking and choosing which they believe is good, which is not good. So what do you reckon I mean, as far as being more independent, where we're able to get this into the curriculum, for example, where to really understand African traditions, but with us as Black people taking the lead in this rather than just doing it through Eurocentrics vision, how they want it writ, because we can go, I feel like with people of our descent, we can go more, express it a lot differently, more passionately, because it's our actual traditions.
Yeah, it's a good question. What do we do? Where do we go from here? How do we see things differently? And
Yeah,
I mean, one of the things that I do as an educator is to teach critical skills, to teach young people, university students, graduate students, how to think critically, to ask, to really get them to think through key questions. So, how did the things that we see as normal come to be that way? And once you start to study, oh, sorry, once you start to study the making of the normal, the histories that allowed certain things to be celebrated, and other things to be demonized, you realize that it's really a play of power. It's about the power of the state. Sometimes it's about individual charisma. It's about the resources, economic resources to make something that way. And that that is sorry, that was a call coming in. I had to
Right.
stop that. So that's the first step, to think about how things came to be historically, what Michel Foucault calls a history of the present. It's about the genealogies, the ways that things come to be heightened and significant, and other things pushed to the background. And then the other thing is to ask, what are the processes through which this is happening today in the contemporary period? So you think historically, the way that things come to be, and then in the contemporary period, what are the rules? What are the laws? What are the norms? What are the values? What are the aesthetics? And why are those aesthetics the predominant ones, whether it has to do with beauty or whether it has to do with certain things that we value? It's really to develop those tools to ask the questions that allow us to see how things come to be the way they are. And that kind of knowledge processing is liberatory. And so it's not just memorizing what we're told, but it's to think critically and to think other ways. And as an educator, it's really the most gratifying experience to see light bulbs turn on for students, for them to see things that they took for granted, the, grandma's stories or the proverbs that they would tell, that they actually start to value them in a way that they never did. In the past, they would brush it off, but then they came to see that those are the tools of survival for someone that grew up in the aftermath of a plantation slavery. This is the way people communicated social norms to each other. And so it's, I think, education, and not just formal education, of course, teaching the tools, but also learning and teaching people to think critically is the key.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Now, another thing I noticed, anthropologist. Um, I also seen that you had qualifications in. Now, usually when I look at a lot of anthropology, it's a lot of like the ancient peoples from the beginning of time. You know, so I was wondering, like, what area of anthropology do you work in?
So I'm a legal political anthropologist. So
Okay.
yeah, so I study law, and in particular international law, the making of law and international law. So a lot of my work has been in places where, so in The Hague, where you have the International Court of Justice as well as the International Criminal Court. I work with international institutions, international bodies. So for the last 20 years, I've been doing most of that work. So the African Union, which is a governing body on the African continent that adjudicates and that puts in place a range of laws, treaties, that negotiates political deals. And so I've been for the last while studying and looking at laws in formation and the processes by which they're debated, rejected, implemented, and what those politics mean.
Okay. Right. So with the African Union, would you see that there's a lot more room for improvements, would you say, with the African Union as far as making Africa great and making the connections with Africans of the diaspora?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I
Making
mean, we've got
Africa,
to be critical, and at the same time, we've got to be positive, but, just to try and whatever is going to make things better, definitely.
yeah, I mean, I think it's important to think about change on multi levels, that
Yes, yeah,
there's one dimension of the African Union, there's one dimension of change that does have to do with leaders, that has to do with lawmakers, that is about having the political will to assert a particular position that can make a difference in people's lives. But the African Union and this kind of partisan politics isn't the only space for change.
yeah.
It's one of them. It can serve a purpose. I mean, as we saw with the recent ICJ action and deliberations, South Africa's and now Egypt's relevance and the significance of bringing that case is potent, right? This has reverberated around the world in ways that we need to pay attention to. And so there's a place for that, but there's also a place for community-based change. Everyday people who are taking their situation in their own hands to protect their communities, to mobilize food resources, to ensure that governance happens in a particular way. And then there's an intermediary space of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and intergovernmental organizations that are doing important work through Amnesty International, or the range of the plethora and proliferation of NGOs that have circulated that are documenting things like human rights abuses, that are documenting them through reports and making them visible and calling on people to mobilize to make change. So there are a lot of levels of change, and the final, of course, has to do with individual change. It has
Yeah.
to do with being critical thinkers, taking the information that we see on whether it's YouTube or Twitter or in a history book, and thinking critically about what is there and what is absent and why is it absent, and to assert a different way of thinking about these things that are absent. So there are many levels of change, and so much of my work has been about mapping certain kinds of change actors like lawyers and politicians, but also thinking about grassroots community activists and everyday people who are asserting change in their lives, whether they be um, in the clergy, or and impacting communities who are in need of direction, and who want to make an individual change in their life, or whether it has to do with teachers or community workers or people providing food for people who need, or providing guidance. So I think there are multiple levels of change, and the key is to think about change in that way, not just our leaders who we demand change
Yeah.
from, but yeah, the ways that we participate in those mobilizations.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a process to get through anyway. So, well, anyway, back to what you're doing today now in Toronto. So, as moving forward, where do you hope to move to? What's the plan? What's the vision?
Yeah, well, so now in my life, I'm still at the University of Toronto. I'm still a professor here,
Yeah.
and I'm the director of the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies. And so that's a center at the university. We teach questions of crime, social order, power, and social change. And it's a justice-oriented center in the sense that um, questions, things like policing and the uses of force, or questions that have to do with law and their application. All of these things are things that my colleagues and I work on. And I'm directing the center, so it puts me in a position of setting an agenda for the next 5 years for the center. One of the really exciting things that we're doing is we're funding projects that are working with former inmates. So people who have been incarcerated, who have come out, who have difficulty finding jobs, and just rebuilding their life. And so we've been funding organizations that are doing work with formerly incarcerated people. There's some really interesting projects that are underway that we're supporting at the center. We're also working with funding graduate students who are doing work all over the world, former victims of um, both victims and former child soldiers who have harmed others in places like Colombia and Uganda and other places. We're supporting projects that allow those who were victimized to really get back on their feet and do the kind of work that they have to do to recoup their lives. In some cases, they're people who have been abducted, and the families can't find members of the family. And so we're funding projects that are doing really interesting work around finding the missing, demanding that governments and members of the police fulfill their mandates, and put out search warrants and actually do the work of finding those people who have been abducted and disappeared. So for as far as the future, it's really about supporting and enabling projects and producing the kind of knowledge about our world that can make a difference. And so that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing at the
Great.
university right
Yes,
now.
so
Yeah,
international as well. It's also international projects
yeah,
also.
yeah, yeah. It's international projects. I mean, some of my own, my one of my current research projects in this regard is around early warning, early response, and it's we've been working with groups in northern Nigeria who
Wow.
there have been high incidents of abductions and
Yeah.
issues around farmers and herders. And so we've been doing some early warning, early response work to support communities. 160 people involved in this early warning, early response project. It's a tech project with using phones to warn and alert people of possible issues, violence, etc. So there's a lot of work going on the ground in the grassroots, and ensuring that that work can be supported and is mobilized, and that we learn from the work that is underway is critical. So that's where I am these days.
That's great. That sounds great. Working with victims and especially it's like northern Nigeria. There's a lot. You have the problems, like you say. We've had like Boko Haram. There's
Yeah.
many different groups. So that's great. I mean, especially over my grandfather was from Nigeria as well.
Oh,
From
really?
Yeah,
Oh, very
yeah,
nice. Okay. Okay.
Ijaw tribe of Delta State. Yeah,
Okay. Oh, great.
so I was
Yeah.
interested to hear
Have,
that.
have
Yeah.
you been back to Nigeria? Have you visited?
I haven't actually visited. I'm waiting to get a passport, a
Okay.
Nigerian passport, and then I'm hoping to go
Okay.
next year for my
Oh,
first time.
fantastic.
I've traveled around Africa, but I need to really go back home.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
Definitely.
nice.
So that's definitely on the agenda. Have you been to Africa yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I've been to, yeah, a lot of countries. I mean, because of the work that I do. Yeah, east, west, north, south. Yeah,
excellent,
the last 20 years.
great. And how do you find? So I'm sure you've worked alongside some African researchers from whether it's universities or
Oh, yes.
involved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had affiliations. I train African students. I mean, a whole range of students, but some of those students are African students from West African universities, Nigerian, Ghanaian, Benin, from Benin, and other places. So yes, of course, it's an important part of the work that I do.
Well, it's even better. You get the more of understanding when you're on the African continent. So mixing with the people, learning about them.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah, in my early days, as an anthropologist, one of my early ethnographies was an ethnography that involved living in southern Nigeria, southwest Nigeria, learning the language and
wow.
understanding everyday life. And that's, of course, what anthropologists do. So, and part of it, I think, when you're put in those situations where it's it's not a tradition that might have been directly passed on to you, you realize how constructed culture really is, that the things that we take for granted, how we eat, how we drive, what we do, what we think, all of those things are shaped by culture and power. And so yeah, my foray into understanding those complexities had to do with the fieldwork that I did in among the Yoruba in southwestern Nigeria and in the Americas.
But that's definitely a language that I'm trying to learn the Yoruba because it's widely spoken in Nigeria. And you can
Oh,
find it other places in the Caribbean and so
yeah.
definitely that's great that you've made that connection. And to be travel different parts of Africa, it's home, the motherland.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
yeah, I really appreciate our discussion today. I give thanks, Professor Kamari Clarke. Thank you very much, and thanks to Professor Small making the introduction. And hopefully, maybe sometime in the future, we could have a further discussion. But she's had a great introduction, and I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, James. Bye
I
bye now.
appreciate anyway. I keep up the good work. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you too. You too. Thanks. Bye bye.
Blessings. Peace.